Hi, Dacher.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
Good, man. How about you?
I can't complain. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV and Meaning of Life TV. You are Dacher Keltner, noted psychologist at UC Berkeley, author of Born to Be Good, also a chief proprietor of, if not the chief proprietor of the website of the Greater Good thing, right? Greater
Yeah.
Good Science Center at Berkeley, and we'll link to that.
Yep,
Which is about the meaning of life,
absolutely.
something it has in common with Meaning of Life TV. And you've got a new book that's going to come out, right?
Yeah. So the Power Paradox comes out through Penguin in May.
The Power Paradox.
Yeah.
What's so paradoxical about power? Or are you keeping it a secret until the big rollout?
You're going to be the first one to know, Bob. So the Power Paradox, and I think it's actually one of the great paradoxes of the human mind, is that we, through very interesting reasons in our social evolution, get power by enhancing the greater good, right? By doing things.
Sometimes I can think of exceptions, but go ahead.
Right, but then the paradox arrives, which is once we feel powerful and we're seduced by our own significance, we do things that are to the detriment of the greater good.
Well, I know I've misused the vast power at my disposal, Dacher, and I feel really bad about that. No, actually, if I ever get any power, I will consult you on how to avoid that other half of the paradox there.
Well, that's where this all goes, is a consulting business. No.
Yeah, I can see. I knew that's where you were headed. I'm sure powerparadox.com is taken by you. So you occupy an interesting role in, I guess, popular culture at the moment, in the sense that there's this movie that's gotten a lot of attention, came out from Pixar, called Inside Out.
Yeah.
And you were one of two psychologists who were the consultants, you and Paul Ekman, your colleague.
Right.
The movie's about the human mind.
Yep.
Very literal and vivid way.
Yeah.
About the human mind of an 11-year-old girl. And so I want to talk to you about it.
Great.
And about what that was like. I saw it last night, prepping for this.
Yeah.
And it was very good.
What do you think?
I'm sure you deserve some of the credit. Well, I thought it was an incredibly ambitious undertaking, and it worked. I mean, really, really hard thing to do. It was literally, it took place inside the girl's mind, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and so the mind, had to be kind of rendered through metaphor.
Yep.
That was meant to bear some resemblance to the actual way the mind works.
Yeah.
And I guess it's not too simple to say that one of the main take-homes is that some of the so-called negative emotions have their positive uses, and in this case, sadness was a key one. So we're going to talk about that. Before we get into that, how did you wind up with this gig?
It was an incredible experience, Bob. I've known the director, Pete Docter. He and I were actually on a scientific panel probably 8 or 9 years ago at our major scientific society. And the topic was, how do we portray emotional expression? And I've worked a lot on the voice and the face and body in expressing emotion. And Pete has tackled really interesting questions like, how do you express emotion with one eyebrow and an animated figure?
Well, what was his background? What had he done to be on this panel in the first place if he's basically a movie maker?
Well, he did Up, and he did the Monsters movie.
Okay.
And then Pixar one of the things that Pixar did to justify his place on the panel was they've just done very sophisticated work on how facial muscles drive movement in the face. What do you do with eyebrows? What do you do with skin and the like? So we're on this panel. We met, had a beer, became acquaintances. And then about 5 years ago, he calls me up and he's like, hey, this is Pete Docter. I want to bring you down to Pixar and talk to you about this idea I have about emotion and how do you create a movie around emotions inside the head of an 11-year-old girl. And like you said, Bob, it's a very complicated task in terms of portraying it artistically. Mm-hmm. And so
giving it narrative drive, it's like,
and even structurally, so I've taught human emotions for 20 years at Berkeley and Madison before. And the central insight we get from the science, which is really a pretty young science, is that emotions drive what's inside the head.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, they transform what's happening outside in your social world, right? And that's a very hard idea.
By influencing your behavior, they transform the reality of your social world, or they transform your perception of the social world, or both.
Or both, right? So if I'm feeling really angry and I'm suddenly suffused with the idea that things are unfair, right? Everything around me, right? My roommates' habits in the kitchen and what my romantic partner says to me, suddenly I feel like everything's antagonistic. It's non-zero, it's zero sum. And so that, and I think the movie tackled that basic notion about emotion inside out ambitiously.
Yeah, it really did. And this take-home lesson that, you know, sadness has its virtues, and that's very consistent with the work you've done for some time, right? I mean, you've emphasized the social functionality of emotions generally.
Yeah. So, you know, as I started to visit with Pete and then Ronnie Del Carmen, who's his main collaborator, and a guy named Josh, you know, kind of a core team, one of the things that we really grappled with, and they settled upon, I think it's 5 or 6 emotions in the head. And they're like, well, let's talk about sadness and let's talk about anger. And, you know, it's interesting in broad swaths of Western thought, we think people tend to deride the emotions. They think they're, you know, dysfunctional, they're bad for us. The last thing you want to do in a family dynamic is have negative emotions. And I think that's a pervasive notion, but the scientific literature shows that these negative emotions, you know, they're like you wrote about in The Moral Animal, which is they have been crafted by evolution to deal with specific problems. So anger, you know, a lot of people would say, wow, I'd rather have anger eliminated in social life.
Right.
But in fact, we'd have no political protest. We'd have a very diminished moral sensibility, as you would probably argue. And so with Pete and his team, we started grappling with, like, how do you portray the upside to the negative emotions?
Yeah. It's interesting because, and I think you saw this to some extent in the movie itself. The negative emotions do have their virtues, and at the same time, they're not entirely virtuous. I mean, as you said, anger in a certain sense can warp your perception of the world. Surely it's not the case that everything in the world is unfair to me, and yet, if you're sufficiently angry, that's kind of the sense you have.
Yeah.
I suppose you could argue that an exaggerated sense of unfairness has its utility. This is interesting. I'm actually getting a phone call on this phone. I'm not aware that this has ever happened. And one thing I can guarantee you is it's not for me. You know, emotions have their, well, anyway, there is this dual-sidedness of emotions, which I know you're quite aware of, and how you harness the good without falling prey to the bad, I guess, is maybe the central challenge of being a human being.
And, you know, it's really interesting. Like, we have these two poles of thinking, like, you know, literally in a lot of places, like, try to eliminate the negative emotions versus, you know, fully manifesting them. And I think where we're landing scientifically is with the principle of moderation, right? Which is in the right place, those emotions, and to the right degree, as Aristotle said, these emotions do a lot of good for us, even fear or anger. And, you know, it's so interesting, Bob. I mean, I've been getting emails from parents of teenagers and people in long-term marriages, right, where they will literally say, like, I saw this movie and my husband started to cry, 60-year-old husband, because he suddenly had this insight seeing the movie that having some of these negative emotions is okay, right, from time to time. And
it's funny. Well, go ahead and finish that. I want to tell you about somebody else who cried.
Yeah. So, you know, I mean, it's just, you know, for a lot of people, the idea that sadness has this set of functions, right? It gets us to change. It gets us to rebuild our social environments. That was a pretty enduring lesson from the film.
was having lunch with a psychologist whom you probably heard of, but I shouldn't name since lunch was presumed to be off the record. But she said she cried at the movie.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, she has, I think, a daughter roughly the age of this girl, Riley, in the movie. And I can imagine how you might cry. Because, for one thing, part of the movie is about growing up.
Yeah.
And some of the things that you lose when you're growing up. And I think I saw in something you wrote that there is a decline, that with adolescence, you start seeing a decline in the prevalence of sheerly positive emotions. In the movie, joy is the dominant player. The character who represents joy in her head is the dominant player. And any of us who have had kids remember those years when it was just all fun and games, and there is something poignant, about the reality of growing up.
Yeah. No. And Pete Docter is a father of a daughter. And was going through this experience of the loss of childhood with his daughter as he conceptualized this movie. Ronnie Del Carmen, his key collaborators, a father of daughters. I'm a father of daughters. I know you got some daughters, and there is, and even Paul Ekman is a father of daughters, and there is. I think it's one of the central motifs in a very deep cultural moment, which is fathers being more engaged in their kids, right? And then all of the new pressures on young girls transitioning to adulthood. And we know scientifically, like you said, Bob, that, man, if you look at the charts of daily positive emotion for young girls at 11 years old, 10 years old, they're at their peak in the childhood years. And from 10 to 14, they fall off a cliff, right? Yeah. And I think what Pete was saying with the film is, this is about the loss of laughter and touch and sitting on dad's lap and wrestling and doing goofy things. Yeah. But you have to do it, right? And it's painful.
Yeah.
And I cried.
And not all the painful emotions are necessarily bad. Again, there's something we said for accepting some of them and even harnessing them in a way. And so let's get into the story itself a little. It's about this girl named Riley, whose family moves to San Francisco when she's 11. By the way, as it happens, my family moved to San Francisco when I was 11. But there the similarity ends. We'd moved around so much it wasn't as traumatic as it was for her, although there was some culture shock, as I recall. But and she apparently has lived in the Midwest, I guess, in Minnesota for presumably her whole life. She's left her friends behind. The furniture is late to show up. She doesn't even have that to reassure her because the moving company screws up and there's this empty apartment. And she gets sad and distressed. And really, the movie is largely about her beginning to undergo an emotional breakdown. I mean, it gets grave and serious, right?
Yeah. No, and if you look at all the data right now on the, what you might rightfully call the trauma of preteen, right? For young girls, it is isolation, loneliness, sadness. It can start to move into stuff that really, really sort of upsets parents, drug use, self-harm, and the like. And it is a movie in some ways about that realm of experience for preteen girls.
Yeah, so she moves at kind of the worst possible time in that sense. It's going to start changing in complicated ways anyway.
Yeah.
Now, what they do is they personify the emotions. They focus on these 5 emotions: joy, sadness, anger, disgust, and I guess fear.
Right.
And one question people may wonder is, why those 5, or are those the 5 big emotions that psychologists agree are the 5 big emotions, or are there arguments about this? And do we have a clear definition of what an emotion is? Because it's a feeling, but there's an endless variety of feelings virtually. So what is the state of discourse on that within psychology? Are those generally agreed to be in some sense the big 5, and what's the argument about?
Yeah, no, it's so interesting you pick up on that, and this is where, and there's this interesting conversation between the film and science, the state of scientific knowledge. So we know there's a paper coming out by Paul Ekman, who surveyed 240 scientists,
and was along with you the other advisor on the movie,
right? And this well-known guy who sort of pioneered the study of facial expression. There's a lot of consensus that those 5 emotions, anger, fear, sadness, disgust, and joy, they have, facial displays, vocal displays, they're universal. Those are pretty sound candidates to be called emotions. And we define emotions as brief, feeling-based states that help us respond to problems and opportunities in the environment. Now, what's really interesting, Bob, is I've actually devoted my career to studying neglected emotions, embarrassment, shame, awe, amusement, love, desire, really interesting states where there isn't a lot of scientific data as yet to make the case they belong in this taxonomy. And when I first met with Pete and Ronnie, the first thing we talked about is like, what should be inside her head, right? And I made the case for, man, you got to have desire and awe and amusement, embarrassment. They didn't make the cut. So, but the film actually captures what is the scientific consensus right now.
That those are the big 5.
Yeah, but I think in 20 years we'll be confident about 15 or 20 states as having the stature of emotion.
I might have voted for embarrassment if I remember my childhood accurately. That would, I mean, especially you're the new kid at school, which he was. Yeah. It's like just, that is on hypersensitivity, that kind of thing, and shame for that matter. I mean, I think I read somewhere that you and Paul Ekman disagree on whether love should be considered an emotion. I think leaving aside the question of whether it belongs in the big 5, and I'm wondering, like, how does an argument like that go? Like, what do you say in defense of the case that it should be an emotion, and what kinds of things would you say by way of differing?
So, it's funny. We really, there's a lot of conceptual work devoted to this. So, we think emotions are brief as opposed to long-standing states like a mood or emotional disorder. They're focused on a pretty specific object in your consciousness, right? Like, I am really fearful of flight or flying in airplanes. And then critically, and this is where we start to marshal evidence to make the case that a state is an emotion, they have some kind of distinct expressive behavior that you can see in mammalian signaling behavior. They have some sort of distinct physiological profile. So, for example, my research on love found it correlates with oxytocin release, which is very conceptually coherent. And then they have some sort of influence upon how we perceive the world that is pretty specific, right? So once you bring those data together and you're studying these states in the lab, so I studied, for example, embarrassment, and it has this display where you get really modest and blush. It's about making social mistakes. You can trace it back to other mammals. And it has a physiological pattern. We start to feel confident we can argue that that's an emotion.
But Paul doesn't agree with you about love.
He does not, and I won't psychoanalyze why Paul Ekman does not think love is an emotion, although I'm capable of doing that. Paul, it's just, I think the data are pretty clear. And most people list love as one of the most cherished, prominent emotions in their lives.
I mean, you could argue that there are varieties of it that would have been designed by natural selection for different purposes, even if natural selection is drawing on. I mean, natural selection uses resources wisely. So if there's already a feeling there that'll serve for the purpose, it'll just kind of like re-engineer that a little for the occasion.
Right.
So on the one hand, I'm sure my love of my daughter has something in common with what I feel in the case of romantic love. On the other hand, they're different. You're right. Oh, yeah. And that's one of the issues you probably come up against.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, Charles Darwin And then subsequent to that, I'm not sure you wrote about this, but John Bowlby and his attachment theory from the late 60s, which is really one of the great Darwinian statements about human relationships. They said, look, when you look at how humans reproduce and bond and then form tight families, we need a natural selection has to take kind of a general sexual impulse and then divide it into more specific emotions, right?
Mm-hmm.
The feeling towards a vulnerable offspring, which is profoundly important.
Mm-hmm.
The pair bonding of affect with a partner, love, romantic love, we're a very unusual primate, as you know, in terms of pair bonding.
Mm-hmm.
And then some sort of sexual feeling that we call desire, for which there's a lot of good data.
By the way, Bowlby wrote a biography of Darwin. I don't know if you ever saw it. It's interesting.
I never did.
He naturally emphasizes the death of Darwin's mother at an early age for Darwin in shaping his character. But another interesting thing is what you said about the importance of the emotion of the feeling being relatively brief and distinct in order to qualify as an emotion. And there too, I would think the lines get a little blurry. I mean, like jealousy, I assume, is considered an emotion by most people, or is that a borderline case?
It's definitely, I would say we've got our big five we've talked about, Bob.
Yeah.
Anger, fear, sadness, disgust, joy, surprise. Then we've got these sort of another set of 10 candidates that are looking pretty good according to the data: awe, embarrassment, sympathy, love, desire. Amusement and laughter is a clear, distinct state. And then out there in the third layer is the kind of these more complicated states, like interest or jealousy or envy, where we're pretty far away from knowing.
It's so distinct and so clearly designed by natural selection, though. And it has different manifestations. You can be insecure about the loss of a physical possession, and that's a little different from being insecure about the loss of a mate, but quite different. But you get the sense that certainly the latter was designed. Well, anyway, so back to this this girl Riley. So the way it's interesting, the way they depict her mind. Okay, you've got these feelings. They chose to focus on the five. Joy is the dominant character because I think partly because Riley hasn't passed through adolescence yet, and partly maybe because that's the kind of girl that Riley has been.
Right.
But then they also have these islands,
right,
that they say together constitute the personality. So there's like Friendship Island, Family Island. I think there's Goofball Island, which is interesting because that's something we know is going to get lost ultimately as she grows up. But her father has these, knows her as this kid who fools around. I used to refer to my daughters as goofballs. At a certain age, I don't anymore, right? I mean, jokingly to their face. I don't mean I pejoratively described them that way to people. What's that?
It's high praise.
Yeah, it is. It was high praise. It absolutely. What I'd give to be a goofball again. So anyway, the idea is that these together constitute the personality of these islands. And I took it to mean that in everyone, things like Friendship Island, Family Island, they're part of the personality. But the exact contours of your particular personality depends on the character of Friendship Island, the character of Family Island, and I think was there an Imagination Island? There were other islands.
Yeah.
First of all, how did that look to you as a psychologist? I mean, we've said, they had the challenge of metaphorically depicting the mind, personifying the elements of the mind, and so on. And you can't maintain complete fidelity to the truth if you're going to do that. But what did you think of this way of looking at it?
I thought so. I think there would be scientists who would take issue with that. So for example, in the study of, personality traits, genetically based dispositions to be in the world, we know there are 5 or 6 basic traits like extroversion and being really warm and kind. And they didn't make it into the basic structure.
No, I noticed that. I mean, the
Yeah, and
first thing a
so
psychologist thinks of is like the five main dimensions of personality, right? Like
right,
extroversion and so on.
right, and I think that what the film says is actually as you rightly noted, Bob, that the kind of the individual idiosyncratic quality of Riley is in the emotions, and I think that's and joy as being her defining emotion,
Hmm.
and I think that's a forward thinking and defensible claim. What I liked about the islands is how I took them as a scientist is, we know that there are these basic structures in our identity through which we relate to the world. One of them is family, right? Attachment systems, to use the scientific language, and how you're connected to your parents and so forth. I mean, that's fundamental, and they got that.
Hmm.
Friendship, as you know, I mean, the scientific literature, once you're 11 or 12, who you become is rooted in your friends, fundamentally, peers, social movements. And I think they got that right. And then I really liked I think what they were saying as well, like with Goofball Island, which I think we so underrepresent play in our sense of human identity. And they really push that, rightfully so, at Pixar, right? So I thought that was a going beyond the data in a sense and justified. But I think there would be issues that people would take with it.
Hmm. And I mean, one thing I liked about it was that it enabled them that metaphor, the island metaphor, was that it enabled them to depict her emotional breakdown in very vivid terms. Because, like, what you saw was the whole collapse of islands. So,
Yeah.
and in a way, that's what a breakdown is. It's no longer a question of, like, what's the exact way you deal with friendship, or the details of your relationship with it. It's like those whole sources of support seem to collapse. It's like you just think no friends, you have no friends, and I thought that was very good.
I mean, I thought that was I thought it was such a striking feature of the film, which is, and in particular how they portrayed it. Like, I think Goofball Island may have been the first one to go, and it's huge and it's awesome, and it almost is like a disaster film, right, where it just starts crashing. And I think, most parents, when their kids really head into the teens, there is this cataclysmic shift of, I can't pat her on the back anymore or give her a hug. Wow, our old joking repartee is now morally offensive. And from her standpoint, the child's
You've noticed that too.
My breath smells like fetid waste, from a garbage dump in her mind. Even just like, I mean, my kids, like, literally, like, I would show up in the clothes I always wear, and they're like, Dad, you can't stand around me look at your hair, I mean, so I think they got it right. There is this collapse and breakdown.
And then there was this idea of, okay, so there were a couple of things. There was the way feelings color memories.
Yeah.
And
Huge.
And kind of not permanently. In other words, I mean, memories have an affective association in the first case, but part of the point, I think, was that then in reflecting on a memory again, your current feeling will color that memory. And that has actual empirical validation, right?
Yeah, I mean, that one, I remember when I was talking with Pete and Ronnie, and they're I mean, in many ways, the film is a meditation upon memory in the past, right? And they asked me very explicitly, and we had a gathering of their core team about how do we remember things, how do emotions guide memories? If we have a really emotional time in the past, right, and I'm feeling different right now, as I sort of dredge up that material, what really prevails, the past emotion or the current emotion in thinking about that event? And there's a really striking researcher named Linda Levine down at UC Irvine, and she's done this elegant, hard work showing it really is our current feelings that drive how we think about the past. So if I'm really mad about a presidential outcome, right, and in the moment when the the election is determined, I'm outraged and I'm all upset. And then I'm asked to recall my experiences of that presidential outcome 5 years later. And I'm feeling okay about it. I'll remember the past as being okay, right? And so many people have reached out to me and said, that's how my past is. It's so shifting according to current emotion.
Right. And I gathered the idea, I mean, some of their kind of description of the way the mind worked went by kind of fast, some of it at the beginning, but I think I got the sense that there were these things they were calling core memories.
Yeah.
I think had a special relationship to the islands that constituted the personality or something. And so these are like really important memories. I gather they're part of the definition of yourself. These are the memories that are the foundations of your narrative about yourself, your conception of yourself. And that's why if they are not conducive to stability, you're in trouble, I guess. Was that kind of the idea?
Definitely. And I feel, it's interesting. I feel there's a case where they went pretty far beyond what we know scientifically. It'd be very hard. Just think about it, right? How would you study core memory and measure it and show its effect in a person's development? But I think intuitively there's, I actually resonated with that idea that there are going to be these paradigmatic moments in your life that have an emotional tone, like, wow, I always remember playing with my younger brother in a certain way. And that is part of who I am.
Right.
And so I think even though the science isn't there, you could get there with certain things we know about core structures in the mind. And I think the art really tells us something new in that case.
Right. Although, again, I guess it can work both ways in the sense that your present state of mind, your present self-conception will influence what, if somebody asks you, well, what are the most important things that happened to you when you were in kindergarten or something, or ever, you would either come up with different memories depending on your present state of mind or color them differently, right?
Yeah, and I think I think one of the things we know developmentally in the scientific literature is our emotions become a little bit more complex, right? That they become nuanced with nostalgia and sadness and delight and, communal rapture and all kinds of different feelings. And I think that was happening in the film when sadness touches the core memories and they have these more complicated hues. So I think that this is one of the great things about human emotion is it's always shifting in what core ways of looking at the world we define who we are.
And I mean, the idea of core memories is kind of implicit in the way people tend to bring up their kids. In other words, when you see parents trying to give their kids some interpretive guidance, something that happened, like it's a piano recital and the kid thinks it didn't go well or something, and you're like, no, you came through it. I mean, you finished the song and blah, 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 and that's the way to think about this, And so the premise of parenting is that, there are these really important memories.
Yeah. And at the same time, I think the film, when the mom says, we really need you after they've moved and the furniture's not around and dad's job's not going too well, the mom's like, we need you to be our happy girl. And she's trying to get the core memories of that move to be good. And that's just not going to work. I think that's a very important statement about how we have to let our kids have their core memories, right?
Right. So there's a kind of, I thought in a way there were two different messages sent by the movie, both of which have their validity. I mean, one of them we've said was, okay, sadness seems like a bad feeling, but hey, feelings have their uses, their virtues, don't be so hard on it.
Yeah.
The other message that I thought came through more at the beginning, and this is more in keeping with things like, I would say, like mindfulness meditation, for example, is that, like, don't take these feelings too seriously. Develop the capacity to ignore them. Because what you're seeing at the beginning of the movie is, like, these characters who represent the feelings, like, they're struggling for control of her perception and interpretation, and how she sees something will just depend on who happened to get to the switches first. Which of the emotions happened to get to the, there's a kind of arbitrariness to it that could lead you to just say, they're just feelings. I mean, try to distance yourself from it, which is a lot of the idea behind mindfulness meditation. But then in the end, it's like, no, this feeling that you would think is one of the ones you want to distance yourself from, sadness, has this virtue, which is it draws. It's a signal you send to friends and family, and if they are indeed friends and loved ones, they will respond appropriately and be nurturing.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow, I hadn't thought about that. And that, I mean, I actually think that is one of the most important lessons in the film, Bob, and you really nicely put your finger on it, which is that, emotions have this really striking paradoxical quality to them, right? Which is, first of all, and Jean-Paul Sartre wrote about this when he talked about how emotions have these magical transformation qualities. They're like, wow, suddenly I am absolutely in the thrall of jealousy or love. They feel absolutely true, right, about the world, and as if nothing else could be true. And at the same time, they are profoundly transient and ephemeral, right? Emotions last 5 seconds, 10 seconds. And so your mind is grappling with this really striking paradox of like, this is so overwhelmingly true. I'm going to die in this panic attack.
Right.
And yet it'll vanish, right?
Right.
And you're absolutely right that that's one of the key lessons of mindfulness is, these emotions that seem so catastrophic actually move through you and subside. They're designed to subside. And I think that notion in the film really, I hope parents and teachers pick up on that as a key lesson.
I read in some of the literature about it and some of the journalism about it, somebody being quoted as saying that was their kids' takeaway.
Wow.
Don't take these feelings too seriously, which is a possible takeaway. But you're right. I mean, the funny thing is these feelings visit us again and again and again and leave us, and we know it. But then we are totally in their thrall. Whether it is sadness, a pessimistic view of your situation, waking up in the middle of the night with some anxiety, that things look a lot worse in the middle of the night than they're going to look at 8 a.m. It doesn't do any good. And when people ask, well, why would you work so hard? Why would you, serious meditations take so much time. Why would you spend the time? It's like really hard to deal intelligently with your emotions. They're designed to delude you.
Yeah.
And, so it is going to take work.
Well, and I think that there's this meta message in the film that, and I wrote a bit about this in the New York Times essay, that, part of what the message of the film is embrace your feelings, like fear. I've had a lot of anxiety and fear in life. And the tens of thousands of dollars you would spend on therapy or whatever it is, in some sense boils down to a central insight, which you see in the film, which is it's okay. You may think you're going to die in a panic attack and your body's all revved up, but 20 minutes from now, you're going to feel differently. And remember that, right? So I'm glad that you're hearing that kids are getting that message. It's really important.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. Now, this is the New York Times piece you co-authored with Paul Ekman?
Yeah.
So we will link to that too. The other little touches in the movie that I thought, there's a fleeting thing about facts and opinions, I think it was. Do you remember that? It's like just a moment. Somebody says, "Yeah, I have trouble telling them apart."
Yeah.
But that's a comment about human psychology, right?
Yeah. Well, we know. I think we do. I don't know if you would agree with this, Bob, but I think we do a pretty good job with various systems of knowledge in sorting out opinions versus facts, right?
Some systems more than others.
And we also know, regrettably, humans tend to think most of their opinions are facts. So, we tend to assume, and I've done a bit of work on this with Lee Ross at Stanford. We tend to think that like how we see the world is factual and objective. So no, I mean that I've seen the film a couple of different times at screenings and the like, and that people love that. The fact opinion.
Yeah, gotta laugh.
Yeah,
when I saw that.
yeah.
I mean, I guess I'd say in what you said, I think the key word is systems. I mean, there are systems that are very good at social systems that are good at distinguishing too, like science.
Yeah.
But that is not a tribute to human rationality, because the system of science is premised on the fact that you can't trust individual people, right? I mean, in other words, it's like we replicate the experiments. We don't, in theory. I mean, there's been a whole issue in psychology about how often they do and don't get replicated and whether they get replicated enough. But leaving that aside, in theory, in science, they're supposed to get replicated by different people, and any one person's assertion is not supposed to count for anything. And the way progress happens is through this social system, not through the brilliance of any single person, in a way.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, all the foundations of the scientific method have sort of eliminate people's opinions and beliefs and ideological commitments, and hope you get some stable truth.
Right. Now, you've used this term naive realism. That's relevant to this kind of right. So, and relevant to what we can and cannot trust about our intuitions. Yeah,
and it really is Lee Ross's, a brilliant Stanford psychologist who I did my graduate work with. Lee had this idea, and it really dates back. There's a philosophical literature on this. Solomon Asch, the great founding social psychologist, wrote about it. And it really is interesting. And I think the scene you're alluding to in the film of kind of people confusing facts from opinions, it's interesting. We tend when we see the world, also filtered through our emotions, we tend to assume it's true, right? We tend to assume it's objective and reasonable. When I look at what's happening with ISIS, I assume I have all the facts and I arrive at a reasonable conclusion. And we know, obviously, given the multiplicity of perspectives on issues, you can have opponents arrive at the same view of the facts, at different views of the facts, and both assume they're objectively right.
Right.
So it's a very interesting quality of our subjective experience. We think it's objective.
In naive realism, I gather that term is applied, among other things, to the case where you disagree with someone and you're kind of convinced that you're just convinced of your rightness and their wrongness. That's part of naive realism, or
and it's pervasive. As we process information and arrive at opinions or beliefs, we think we have all the facts and all we naively assume what we perceive as real and complete. Mm-hmm. And when someone comes in with a different opinion, and this was work we did 20 years ago, since replicated, it strikes us, how could you arrive, given this information, how could you think that so-and-so is a great political candidate, or that painting is not strong? And so we assume their views of reality are distorted and biased and politically motivated. So it's a powerful intuition.
Yeah, and I mean, speaking of ISIS, there's another human cognitive dynamic that I think complicates progress in a way that I'm starting to think is pretty deeply built in some sense. And it's just that the more evil somebody is, the more bad they are, the more bad the stuff they do is, the more resistance there is to explaining why they did it. Right? Like if you start saying, well, you have to understand, one thing that makes people join ISIS is whatever. Like in Iraq, the Sunnis were deprived of their rights, or any kind of explanation. The first thing you hear is, wait, so you're justifying their behavior? It's like, no, I'm not. Let me go on the record. I'm against beheading innocent people, okay? I'm just trying to ask one
That's interesting.
of these things. So then if there's something we can do to reduce the number of people who join them, that would be good. But I really think it has something to do with the built-in psychology of of blame and absolution or something. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's a fascinating observation, Bob, that I haven't heard in the social science literature, that when we get to the extremes of human behavior, we are very loath to provide rational psychological explanations like, well, they had traumatized childhoods and
Right.
economic factors and climate or whatever it is. I think that's really striking, that we really stick to the idea that there are certain categories of behavior that are inexplicable.
And
right?
that to explain them would be to absolve the people of
Right.
moral responsibility. I think that's kind of what comes close to being like a built-in intuition.
Yeah.
But anyway, I digress. So, anything else you want to say about the movie? I think you should be very proud that you played a role.
Well, thank you. It was I mean, it was so striking to have been teaching the science of emotion for 20 years, and then to have these really talented artists and storytellers really pay attention to the science. Well, I think, first of all, if you're a father of daughters,
Mm-hmm.
you should see the movie,
Yeah.
right? And I mean,
Daughters.
what?
Or a mother of daughters.
Or a mother of daughters. So, but I think, and I like your thinking about. I think that I would think about what it is. What are the key ethical insights that come out of it? Like the idea, we should embrace these emotions. And then I would also, one of the things I look forward to is thinking if there's going to be a sequel, just use your imagination to think about, God, imagine Riley first year of college, right? And what would emotions be, and and it's a really interesting exercise of the imagination.
Really would be. And Pixar has been known to do sequels too.
They're not alone.
They're not alone. Although Toy Story is very much, similarly traces the psychology through developmental, and has its own kind of poignance. I don't know if you've seen the Toy Story trilogy, but if you have kids,
Yes.
There's something particularly poignant about I think it's the third one, right? There were three, but. Well, okay, and finally, just tell us a little about the Greater Good thing, your website. Like I said, we'll link to it. But
Yeah.
I noticed you update it very often, and you get a good response. I mean, you put topical stuff out, recent research findings and stuff that the people actually seem to read.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. We're comrades in common cause, or whatever the term would be. So. The Greater Good Science Center started 13 years ago, and our idea was, there is this very important social, biological, scientific literature on cooperation and altruism and mindfulness and gratitude and sympathy that you've nicely captured in some of your books, and we wanted to translate it to usable, actionable ideas and essays. And so we've got a great team putting out stuff daily, weekly, on these kind of 7 or 8 core themes of gratitude, mindfulness, empathy, compassion, and so on. And, we've got several 100,000 people a month looking at it, teachers, health educators, health providers, policymakers, interested citizens, right, who want to know, wow, how, just to go back to the film, like, man, I'm struggling with my teen daughter. Our dinner time is suddenly conflict and not a moment of gratitude. What do I do? Right? And I think we've got a few answers.
Yeah. Well, great. I recommend that people check it out.
Thank you.
And I recommend that people, as soon as possible, pre-order your book, The Power Paradox, as soon as it's possible to pre-order it. And you should come back and talk to us, certainly when the book's out, possibly sooner, ideally sooner.
Yeah, I'd love to.
And good luck with all your work. Continued success in influencing popular culture benignly.
Well, thank you, Bob, and it's always good to be with you.
Same here. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.